Dana White doesn't care about the UFC, and the reason is pretty sad. If you've been a fan of the UFC for a few years now at least, then you've probably noticed how recently the quality of the UFC fights just hasn't been up to standard. I can remember not even that long ago, on any given UFC card there will be tons of solid names across the entirety of the card, which used to be one of the better selling points for the UFC against boxing. And ironically, boxing has been putting on consistently better cards than the UFC. Now, I don't know if the honeymoon period for the UFC is worn off and the struggles are really starting to show now, but it does feel like for a lot of UFC fans, all you've ever wanted was for Dana to hold you while you were out together, and all it took was a white dress for him to step out on a 20+ year marriage. Hey, and I mean, you probably have friends that have cheated on their partners, and hey, you might have done it yourself, but the difference here is that Dana didn't step out for Stacey from HR. Dana White stepped out for something a little more attractive. Canelo Crawford. And just quickly aiming for 600 subs, so if you can, subscribe. Now, to be fair, you can't really blame Dana for wanting to be involved in what might be the fight of the century, especially when he's wanted to get involved in the sport of boxing for ages, even being involved in boxing in the earlier days of his career. Top of the fact that during the Mayweather and McGregor press conference, a lot of people on that stage were taking the piss out of him for being a failed boxing promoter. So it's pretty fair for him to want to be involved in the biggest boxing event in the sport right now, and for him to be the one to take the mantle of this fight instead of some of the best boxing promoters like Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, and Bob Arum. And it really is an embarrassment on their part for them not being involved in such a huge fight. And we've already seen the effects of Dana White and the UFC's influence on this event already. The production coming from the UFC and coming from Dana White is definitely a plus for the sport of boxing. And when you add the endless money coming from Turkey and the Saudis, and then add on the money that's coming from Netflix, I think the production value is going to be much better than almost everything we've seen from a general high-end boxing event. But the sad reason why Dana White doesn't care about the UFC is that for Dana, boxing is a fresh, new enterprise. When it comes to putting on great MMA fights, he's already been dominating the space so much so that the UFC is seen as MMA, reaching a level of success where they've become synonymous with the commodity that they're selling. Similar to how Vaseline and Tupperware are actually brand names that sell petroleum jelly and plastic containers, the UFC's success is on equal footing when it comes to being that dominant. So it feels like there aren't much more things that Dana White can achieve with the UFC with him being at the helm. He's already signed multi-billion-dollar deals for the UFC and promoted some of the biggest fights in combat sports history. Here's the thing, when you've built the UFC from a $2 million business to a $12 billion global juggernaut, things become easy. And I feel like with these CEO types, it really isn't about how much money you can make. Well, at least it's not only about the money you can make. I think these people enjoy doing difficult things, and I just feel like the UFC doesn't feel like it's difficult for Dana White anymore. Problem is that over the past few months, it does feel like the quality of the UFC has gone down quite a bit. Currently halfway through the year, and I'm pretty sure you can't remember any notable moments from the UFC this year. Barring what happened recently at UFC 317, doesn't feel like there were any notable moments in the UFC. And excluding Hamzat and Dricus du Plessis, which is going to be coming up fairly soon, there isn't a single confirmed pay-per-view event that the UFC is putting on that I'm looking forward to or excited for. And I guess the UFC is just in a bit of an odd spot where many fans online have felt that it's either stagnated or declined. And I mean, do you know how crazy it is for Jamal Hill versus Roundtree to not be the saddest thing that happened that night? How the hell, in the middle of flipping Baku on a UFC fight night, that they announce that Tom Aspinall is the heavyweight champion?
John Jones called us last night and retired. John Jones is officially retired. Tom Aspinall is the heavyweight champion of the UFC.
That should have deserved either a dedicated video, a press conference specifically for him being the champ, as well as announcing something as huge as John Jones' retirement. And I mean, at this point, I'm not too fussed, just because I think Jones is a bit of a shit person. So him not getting anything that's heavily fanfared, I don't really care. On top of the fact that he's unretired 13 days later, all in all, it's not that much of a big deal in hindsight. And at this point, it feels like the UFC is just in a bit of a rough spot in general, and it feels like it might be a chicken and egg situation where it's either the UFC is sliding because Dana White is spending less time, or is Dana White spending less time with the UFC because the UFC is sliding. But all in all, I feel like the next few months and years of the UFC are gonna be very important in deciding how the future of the UFC goes.